The gallery was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. As Thomas Reed moved carefully through the empty corridors, his eyes lingering on a particular painting that seemed almost out of place amidst the other works. It was a small, dimly lit piece tucked away in the corner of the room, its canvas slightly worn, the colors subdued yet somehow still vibrant in their desolation. A dark forest, a narrow path, and a glimmer of moonlight breaking through the trees. It was hauntingly familiar, though he couldn't quite place why. As he studied the intricate brushstrokes, he heard a soft voice from behind him. "Do you know her?" Startled, Thomas turned to find a young boy, no older than 10, standing a few feet away, staring up at him with a serious, almost piercing gaze. The child's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was a stranger, certainly no child of any of the gallery's regular patrons. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Thomas asked, his voice a blend of curiosity and concern. "Are you lost?" The boy shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving Thomas. "She said you would understand. She told me to find you." Thomas felt a chill run through him. "Who are you talking about?" "Catherine," the boy replied, as if the name alone should explain everything. Thomas froze, his mind racing. Catherine was a name from his past, a name he had tried to bury along with so many memories. The name felt almost foreign on his lips as he whispered it, half disbelieving. "Catherine?" The boy nodded. "She told me you'd want to know." It felt as if the air had thickened, the weight of the boy's words pressing down on him. His mind swirled with questions. How could this child know about Catherine? How could he know to find Thomas in this gallery, on this very day? What exactly did she say? Thomas demanded, his voice barely steady. The boy reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. Without another word, he handed it to Thomas, his eyes still fixed on him, waiting. Thomas unfolded the note with trembling hands, and as he read the familiar handwriting, his heart nearly stopped. It was Catherine's unmistakable script, words carefully pinned as though she knew he'd be reading them. "I never forgot. Find him. Tell him everything." Thomas's hands shook as he looked back at the boy, the questions piling up, each more urgent than the last. But the boy merely turned, his footsteps echoing softly as he began to walk away. "Wait," Thomas called after him, taking a step forward. "Tell me, what do you mean? Who are you?" The boy paused, glancing back over his shoulder with a look that seemed far too old for his young face. "She said you'd know," he replied quietly, "and that it's time." Before Thomas could say another word, the boy disappeared through the gallery doors, leaving Thomas standing alone, clutching the note that had reopened the wounds he'd spent years trying to heal. Thomas stood alone in the gallery, clutching Catherine's note with fingers that trembled slightly. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just words but the weight of all he'd buried. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but the past rushed back too quickly, pulling him under. It had been nearly 15 years since Catherine had walked out of his life, her last words to him still as clear as if she'd spoken them yesterday. They had been young, reckless, hungry for life, and for each other. Catherine, with her fierce independence, her eyes that saw the world in ways he never could, and her heart that seemed too big for her own good. She had been unlike anyone he had ever known, and loving her had been as exhilarating as it was terrifying. But he had let her go. Or maybe, he corrected himself now, he had pushed her away. Thomas's eyes snapped open, focusing once again on the painting before him. The dark forest, the narrow path. This was her work, he realized with a sharp intake of breath. How had he not seen it before? She had painted this exact scene in one of her old sketchbooks, back when they'd spent endless nights talking about dreams, fears, and places they'd never actually visit. She had once described the forest as her vision of somewhere else, a place where she felt free, yet alone. As the memories pressed harder, Thomas turned and left the gallery, the note still clutched in his hand. He barely noticed the quiet streets outside, nor the brisk chill in the air as he walked, his mind lost in a haze of memories. He needed to make sense of this, and there was only one person who might know where to begin. Clara, Catherine's closest friend and, for a time, his confidant as well. The next morning, Thomas found himself at the entrance of a cozy bookstore tucked in a quiet corner of the city. Clara had bought the store years ago, pouring herself into it after Catherine had left. She had always been a grounding force, the calm to Catherine's storm, and as he entered, he hoped she might still be able to ground him now. Clara spotted him almost immediately, her eyes widening slightly before she gave a small, sad smile. "Thomas," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "It's been a while." He nodded, his throat tightening at the sight of her. She hadn't changed much, still the same wise, thoughtful expression, the same patient gaze. "Clara," he managed, his voice low. Something happened." She watched him closely, waiting as he found the words. A boy came to the gallery last night," he said, pulling the note from his pocket and handing it to her. "He gave me this. Said it was from Catherine." Clara took the note, her expression softening as she recognized the handwriting. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice catching. I didn't know." Thomas looked at her, surprised. "Didn't know what?" She took a deep breath, carefully folding the note. "Catherine asked me not to tell you. She said you'd moved on, that you'd be better off not knowing." "Not knowing what, Clara?" He struggled to keep his voice steady, feeling the anger and confusion rise. "I haven't heard from her in over a decade. I thought she was gone." Clara's gaze dropped, and for a moment, she seemed lost in her own thoughts. Finally, she looked up. "You and Catherine, it was complicated. You know that." Thomas sighed, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Complicated is putting it lightly." She gave him a sad smile. "She loved you, Thomas. I think that's why she left. She thought she was protecting you." "Protecting me from what?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Clara, please. If there's something I need to know, you have to tell me." Clara hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if weighing whether to trust him with whatever secret she'd held onto all these years. Finally, she let out a long breath. "Maybe you should meet him." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "Who? The boy?" She nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "He's not just any boy, Thomas. He's Catherine's son." The words hung in the air, cutting through the silence like a knife. Thomas felt his breath hitch as the realization washed over him. Catherine had a child, a son, and, if he was honest with himself, a sinking suspicion had already started forming in his mind, one he had refused to acknowledge. "How old is he?" Thomas asked quietly, though he feared he already knew the answer. Clara met his gaze, her expression full of unspoken understanding. "He just turned 10. 10 years. Catherine had been gone for 10 years, and the boy who had appeared in his gallery looked so much like her it was almost as if he'd seen a ghost. Thomas felt his hands tremble as he struggled to process this. Clara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but she was so certain. She thought it was better this way. But why now? Why send him to me after all these years?" Thomas asked, feeling his voice shake. Clara's eyes softened. "Maybe she felt it was time for you to know. And maybe, just maybe, he deserves to know you too." Thomas sat there in silence, the weight of Catherine's secret pressing down on him. This boy, Catherine's son, was likely his son as well. She had kept this from him, kept him out of her life, and now she was gone, leaving only this mystery in her wake. But one thing was clear. He had to find the boy again. He had to know the truth. The chill in the air grew sharper as Thomas made his way back to the gallery that evening, his mind heavy with Clara's revelation. Every step felt like he was moving through a fog, his thoughts churning, replaying the image of the boy with Catherine's eyes, his face pale yet defiant as he handed over the note. 10 years. Thomas's heart ached with a strange, bitter regret that felt as fresh as the night Catherine had left. The boy, no, his son, had appeared as suddenly as she had vanished. As he entered the gallery, it was quiet and dimly lit, with only a few spotlights casting soft glows over the artwork. The painting of the dark forest was still there, almost waiting for him, as if it, too, knew the secrets Catherine had kept hidden. Thomas approached it slowly, studying the strokes, the familiar patterns that he now recognized were distinctly Catherine's. She had once told him that the forest represented both a journey and a retreat, a place where she could confront her fears and escape them at the same time. Lost in thought, Thomas barely noticed the sound of footsteps until they stopped just behind him. He turned, and there was the boy again, standing in the soft shadow cast by the overhead light. He looked up at Thomas, his expression serious, waiting for him to speak. "How did you find me?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper, unsure if he wanted an answer. The boy shifted slightly, a small shrug of his shoulders. "I knew you'd be here. She told me about this place." Thomas took a shaky breath, steadying himself. "Your mother? She told you about me?" The boy nodded. "She told me stories. She said you were important." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Thomas could see now that he was trying to be brave, holding back whatever sadness or confusion lay behind those deep, brown eyes. Thomas knelt down, looking him in the eye. "What's your name?" he asked softly, realizing he hadn't even asked that simple question before. "Michael," the boy replied, and for the first time, his face softened a little, his lips turning up in a faint, tentative smile. "She used to call me Mikey." "Mikey," Thomas repeated, the name feeling strange and somehow familiar on his lips. He had dreamed of having a son one day, of teaching him how to ride a bike, of telling him stories of his own childhood. And now, here he was, but the reality felt almost surreal, more like a stranger's life than his own. "Why did she send you to me, Mikey?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper, feeling the sting of the question even as he spoke it. "Why now?" Mikey shifted his gaze, looking down at the floor. "She was sick," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "For a long time. She didn't want to tell you because she thought it would make things harder." Thomas's heart twisted. He reached out, placing a hand on Mikey's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mikey. I didn't know." Mikey looked up, his face etched with a seriousness far beyond his years. "She didn't want anyone to know. But before she left, she told me to find you. She said you'd want to know the truth." Thomas felt a surge of grief mixed with frustration, his chest tight with the weight of all the lost time, the years he had spent not knowing. He wished he could ask Catherine why she had made that choice, why she had kept him from knowing about his own son. But there was no one to ask, and the only answer lay in the boy standing before him. Mikey looked away, his eyes fixed on the painting. "She told me you'd understand this," he murmured, nodding toward the dark forest, "that it was a place where she felt safe." Thomas followed his gaze, the memory of Catherine's words echoing in his mind. "She called it her refuge," he said quietly, "a place to hide from everything, even herself." Mikey's eyes softened as he looked at the painting, his small hand reaching up to touch the edge of the frame. "She said you used to come here to think. She said I should find you here when I was ready." Thomas was silent, his mind racing as he pieced together the fragments of Catherine's life, the decisions she had made, and the secrets she had kept. He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt for not being there, for letting her go, for not even knowing she had been sick. And now, here was this boy, a living reminder of the woman he had once loved, of the life they might have shared. Finally, he looked down at Mikey. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked, hoping the boy had someone waiting for him, a safe place to call home. Mikey shook his head, his expression unreadable. "I'm staying with friends of my mom, but it's not like home." Thomas hesitated, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had never been a father, never known what it meant to care for someone other than himself. But looking at Mikey, he knew he couldn't let him walk away again. "Would you like to come stay with me tonight?" he asked, his voice softer, almost unsure. Mikey's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope, but he quickly masked it, shrugging with a feigned nonchalance. "If it's okay with you." Thomas nodded, a strange sense of purpose settling in his heart. "It's more than okay." They walked out of the gallery together, Thomas's hand resting gently on Mikey's shoulder. The night air was cool, and they moved in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they walked toward Thomas's apartment, he glanced down at the boy beside him, feeling a strange mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe he had found something he didn't even know he was looking for. Thomas unlocked the door to his small, minimalist apartment and stepped aside. Watching as Mikey entered cautiously, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. The boy was quiet, carrying himself with a certain guardedness that made him seem older than his years. Thomas had known enough people who wore the same look, and it struck him just how much the boy must have seen, how much he had lost, to bear that weight on his young shoulders. Mikey glanced up at him, almost as if asking for permission, and Thomas nodded reassuringly. "Make yourself at home," he said, hoping the words didn't sound as hollow to Mikey as they did to him. The boy moved hesitantly toward the couch, glancing back at Thomas with a question in his eyes. "Do you want something to eat?" Thomas asked, suddenly aware that he hadn't prepared for this. He had nothing to offer the boy except a few leftovers, maybe some bread. He didn't know what a kid Mikey's age might want to eat, didn't even know what he liked. Mikey nodded slightly, his voice soft. "Maybe just some water?" Thomas managed to smile, though he felt a pang of sadness. Water, that was all he asked for, as if he didn't want to impose. Thomas went into the kitchen, pouring a glass from the tap, his hands moving automatically even as his mind spun with questions. He handed the glass to Mikey, who took it with a quiet thank you and sipped it carefully, his small hands wrapping around the glass like it was something precious. They sat in silence for a while, Thomas unsure how to bridge the distance between them, unsure even of what questions to ask. He had spent so long keeping his life simple, keeping people at arm's length. And now here was this boy, this living, breathing reminder of everything he'd left behind. "So," he began awkwardly, clearing his throat. "Your mom, she told you about me?" Mikey nodded, setting the glass down carefully on the table. "She told me you were someone she used to know, that you were important to her." He hesitated, glancing up at Thomas with a searching look. "She said that once I met you, I'd know what she meant." Thomas felt a sharp pang in his chest. He wondered how Catherine had described him, what words she had used. Did she tell Mikey about the good moments, their nights spent talking under the stars, their plans to travel the world? Or had she told him about the end, the arguments, the reasons they had both walked away? She was an amazing person," Thomas said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I never stopped thinking about her. I just didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Mikey was quiet, his face solemn as he listened. After a moment, he looked down, picking at the edge of his shirt. "She didn't talk about being sick," he murmured. "Not until the end. I think she didn't want me to worry. She always tried to make it seem like everything was fine." Thomas closed his eyes, guilt tightening in his chest. He thought of all the times he could have reached out, all the chances he'd had to find her, but he had convinced himself she was better off. He'd let her go, let her face whatever battles she'd fought alone. "I wish I'd known," he whispered, more to himself than to Mikey. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence settled around them, thick and heavy, until Mikey's quiet voice broke through. "She left something for you," he said, reaching into his backpack. Thomas's eyes followed his hand as Mikey pulled out a small, worn notebook, its cover faded and edges frayed. He held it out, his gaze meeting Thomas's as he said, "She wanted me to give this to you." Thomas took the notebook with trembling hands, his fingers tracing the familiar worn edges. Catherine had always kept notebooks, filling them with sketches, notes, and even fragments of poetry. He remembered how she'd guard them fiercely, claiming that her notebooks held pieces of herself, pieces that she shared with no one. And now here he was, holding what was likely one of her last. He opened it slowly, his breath catching as he saw her handwriting, the loops and lines unmistakable. The first page held only a few words, written in her familiar, hurried scrawl. "To Thomas, if you ever find your way back." He swallowed hard, turning the page carefully, as if the book itself were made of fragile glass. There were drawings, sketches of places he recognized, parks they'd wandered through, old buildings they'd admired, the gallery where they'd met. It was as if she'd captured every place, every moment they had shared, leaving him a trail of memories. On one page, she'd written, "I never stopped wondering about you." Below it, She had sketched a pair of hands reaching out toward each other but never quite touching. The drawing felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of all the years they'd spent apart, all the things they'd left unsaid. Mikey watched him, his eyes wide, taking in every reaction. "She wrote in it all the time," he said, his voice a soft echo in the room. "Sometimes, she'd sit for hours, just writing or drawing. She said it helped her remember." Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting Mikey's. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for bringing this to me, for being here." The boy gave a small nod, his expression serious. "She wanted you to have it," he said simply. "She thought it might help you understand." Thomas felt a surge of emotions he couldn't put into words, a mix of gratitude, sorrow, and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. A strange kind of hope. He reached over, placing a hand on Mikey's shoulder, feeling the boy lean slightly into his touch, as if he, too, needed this moment, this connection. They spent the rest of the evening looking through the notebook together, Mikey pointing out his favorite sketches, sharing bits and pieces of stories Catherine had told him. For the first time, Thomas felt like he was beginning to understand the life Catherine had lived after they'd parted ways. He could see her resilience, her love for Mikey, her determination to create something beautiful even as her own light began to fade. As night settled over the city, Mikey grew sleepy, his eyelids drooping as he leaned against Thomas's shoulder. Thomas looked down at him, feeling a swell of protectiveness that was as unexpected as it was powerful. He wrapped an arm around the boy, holding him close as he drifted off to sleep, his small form curled up like he belonged there. In that quiet moment, Thomas knew there was no turning back. This boy, his son, needed him. And as much as he had avoided responsibility, avoided connection, he realized now that he needed Mikey, too. They were both lost in different ways, both searching for something to hold on to. And maybe, just maybe, they had found it in each other. The early morning light seeped through the blinds, casting a soft glow over the quiet apartment. Thomas lay awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the weight of the previous night settled over him like a heavy blanket. Next to him, on the couch, Mikey was still asleep, curled up in a small ball beneath a throw blanket. His face was relaxed, peaceful in sleep, a stark contrast to the wary expression he'd worn last night. Thomas watched him, feeling a pang of responsibility that was both foreign and grounding. It was strange, he thought, how life had turned so quickly. Just days ago, he had been alone, his days marked by a routine he had long since perfected. And now, here was this boy, a boy who had his mother's eyes, his mother's spirit. Thomas felt a sudden, urgent need to know more, to fill in the gaps that had grown between himself and Catherine over the years. As the sun rose higher, Mikey began to stir, blinking awake and looking around with a slight confusion before his eyes landed on Thomas. For a moment, his face softened, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Morning, Mikey," Thomas replied, trying to keep his tone light, though his mind was racing with questions. "Did you sleep all right?" The boy nodded, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, better than usual." He hesitated, glancing around the apartment, as if still unsure of his place here. Thomas noticed the uncertainty and decided to try something that might make him feel more at ease. "How about we go get some breakfast?" he suggested. "There's a cafe down the street. I bet they have pancakes." Mikey's eyes lit up, a glimmer of excitement breaking through his cautious demeanor. "Pancakes? Really? Really?" Thomas said with a small smile, feeling a flicker of warmth at the boy's reaction. "Get your shoes on and we'll head out." A few minutes later, they stepped out into the crisp morning air, the city just beginning to wake around them. Mikey walked close to Thomas, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his gaze flickering between the people they passed and the buildings towering above them. Thomas found himself studying the boy's expressions, trying to understand this child who was still a mystery to him. The cafe was quiet, a few early risers scattered around with their newspapers and coffee cups. Thomas led Mikey to a small table by the window, giving him a view of the street outside. Mikey seemed fascinated, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. When the waitress came by, Thomas glanced at Mikey, nodding for him to order first. Could I have the pancakes, please? He asked, his voice polite but hopeful, as if he expected her to say no. Of course, hon, the waitress said with a smile, jotting down his order. Anything else? Bacon? Maybe? Mikey glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Bacon sounds good. As the waitress walked away, Mikey looked back at Thomas, a small smile playing at his lips. Thanks for bringing me here. Anytime, Thomas replied, feeling a strange sense of pride at being able to give the boy this small joy. I used to come here a lot. It was one of your mom's favorite places, too. Mikey's expression softened, his gaze dropping to his hands. She didn't talk much about the past, he murmured. Just little things, like how you'd go to art galleries, or how you both liked old movies. Thomas felt a pang of sadness. She was always better at moving forward than I was, he said quietly. I think she wanted to protect you from some things that might have been hard to understand. Mikey looked up, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. Like what? Thomas hesitated, wondering how much he should tell the boy. How could he explain the choices they'd made, the reasons why they'd parted? Your mom and we were both stubborn, he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. We loved each other, but we each had dreams that took us in different directions. I think she wanted to make sure you grew up without those same complications. Mikey nodded, his gaze thoughtful. She always wanted me to be happy. She'd say that a lot, especially at the end. Thomas swallowed, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. He could almost hear Catherine's voice, soft and resolute, telling him how important it was to her that Mikey have a good life, a stable one. She was a strong person, he said, his voice filled with both admiration and regret. Stronger than I ever realized. Their food arrived, and for a while, they ate in companionable silence. Mikey dug into his pancakes with the enthusiasm of a boy who hadn't had a good breakfast in a while, and Thomas couldn't help but smile, watching him with a sense of both pride and responsibility. It was a small thing, just breakfast in a cafe, but somehow, it felt like the beginning of something bigger. After they finished, Thomas leaned back, studying Mikey. There's something I'd like to show you, he said, trying to keep his tone casual. Something from your mom. Mikey looked at him, intrigued. What is it? It's a place she loved, Thomas replied, standing up and offering his hand. Mikey took it without hesitation, and they left the cafe, heading toward the park where he and Catherine had spent countless afternoons, dreaming of futures they never got to share. The park was quiet, the morning sun casting a gentle glow over the trees and pathways. Thomas led Mikey to a small, hidden spot by the pond, a place he and Catherine had always claimed as their own. It was nothing special, just a bench under a large oak tree, but to him, it felt sacred. This is where your mom and I used to come, he said softly, sitting down on the bench and gesturing for Mikey to join him. We talk about anything and everything. Life, art, the places we wanted to go. Mikey sat beside him, his gaze fixed on the pond. Did she tell you why she left? Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sting of regret. She thought it was best. I didn't agree at the time, but looking back, I think she wanted to make sure you'd have a safe, stable life. And she didn't think I could give you that. Mikey's face tightened, a mixture of sadness and understanding in his expression. She didn't want me to be hurt, he murmured. She always said I should keep people close, but not too close. Thomas's heart ached at the boy's words. He could see Catherine in him, the same cautious heart, the same reluctance to let people in. Mikey, he said gently, I know it might be hard to believe, but you don't have to keep people at arm's length. Sometimes, letting people in can make you stronger. Mikey looked up at him, studying his face with a seriousness that was almost unsettling. Do you think she'd be okay with me being here? With you? Thomas felt a surge of emotion, a fierce protectiveness that he hadn't realized he was capable of. He reached over, placing a hand on Mikey's shoulder. I think, he said softly, she wanted you to be with someone who loved you. And I'd like to be that person, if you'll let me. Mikey's eyes glistened, and he nodded, a small, tentative smile breaking through. For the first time, Thomas saw a glimpse of hope, of trust, and he felt a swell of relief, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were both beginning to heal. They sat together in silence, watching the ducks glide across the pond, feeling the gentle warmth of the sun as it rose higher. And in that quiet moment, Thomas knew that, though he could never change the past, he had been given a second chance, a chance to build something new, something real, with the son he had never known he had. That evening, Thomas sat alone in his apartment, the quietness settling over him like an old, heavy coat. Mikey had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up on the couch with a blanket, his breathing steady and calm. Thomas watched him for a while, taking in the peaceful rise and fall of his chest, feeling a mix of emotions that were almost too big to hold. A strange new sense of purpose filled him, yet with it came an old, familiar guilt, gnawing away at the edges of his mind. After making sure Mikey was fast asleep, Thomas poured himself a small glass of whiskey, hoping it would quiet his thoughts. He sat at the table, Catherine's notebook open in front of him. The pages were filled with sketches, words, and thoughts that painted a picture of her life. A life he had been shut out of, and a life she had, for some reason, chosen to end without him. His eyes scanned the lines, her handwriting fading in and out as memories surfaced. He could almost hear her voice, feel her presence, as he read each entry. One page in particular caught his attention. Catherine had written it in her last months, judging by the worn, slightly smudged ink and the desperation in her words. "I always thought love was supposed to make you stronger," she'd written. "But with him, I felt too much, like I was burning. Leaving was the hardest thing I ever did, but it felt like the only way to survive." Thomas closed his eyes, her words cutting deep. He remembered how fiercely independent she had been, how she had pushed him away the moment things had become too intense. At the time, he hadn't understood, had thought it was something he could fix, if only he loved her enough. But Catherine hadn't wanted fixing. She'd wanted space, a freedom she could never quite explain to him. And now he was left to wonder if, in some way, he had driven her away, made her feel trapped when all she had ever needed was to breathe. He took a sip of whiskey, the warmth spreading through his chest as he tried to make sense of it all. But just as he felt himself slipping further into his regrets, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're still awake?" Thomas looked up, surprised to see Mikey standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. The boy looked small, his hair messy from sleep, his expression both curious and concerned. Thomas set down the glass, feeling a pang of guilt at having woken him. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." Mikey shuffled over, glancing at the notebook on the table. He seemed to hesitate, then looked up at Thomas with an uncertain expression. "Is it about my mom?" Thomas nodded, unsure how much to say, unsure if Mikey was ready for the weight of what he'd been reading. But the boy's eyes were steady, patient, and in that moment, Thomas saw a resilience that reminded him so much of Catherine. "Yeah," Thomas admitted, his voice soft. "I'm just trying to understand everything. Your mom, the choices she made, and why she felt she had to do it alone." Mikey slid into the chair across from him, his gaze fixed on the notebook. He didn't speak for a long time, his small hands resting on the table, his eyes clouded with thoughts too big for his age. Finally, he looked up at Thomas. "She told me that you two were different," he said quietly, "that she loved you. But it wasn't the kind of love that made things easy." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "She told you that?" Mikey nodded, glancing down again. "Yeah, she'd say that sometimes you can love someone, but it's like you're both standing on different sides of a river. And even if you want to cross, you can't always get there." The boy's words struck him like a punch, and Thomas found himself blinking back tears. Catherine had always had a way of seeing things like that, of understanding love in ways that had never quite made sense to him. He had always thought of it as something you fought for, something you held on to, no matter the cost. But for Catherine, love had been both beautiful and burdensome, something she feared would consume her if she didn't keep it at arm's length. Thomas reached across the table, placing a hand on Mikey's. "I wish I had understood her better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe then, maybe she wouldn't have felt so alone. Mikey looked down at their hands, his own small, his fingers slightly trembling. She wasn't always alone, he murmured. I was with her. But she'd talk about you sometimes. When she thought I wasn't listening, Thomas's heart broke a little more with each word. He could see now that Catherine had never stopped loving him, even as she'd forced herself to let him go. And as he looked at Mikey, he realized that Catherine's love had found a way to endure, had found its way back to him in the form of this boy, this brave, thoughtful child who had somehow carried the weight of her absence all on his own. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Mikey, he began slowly, his voice filled with both resolve and tenderness. I know I wasn't there before. I know I missed a lot, but I want to be here for you now. Whatever you need, wherever you want to go, I want to be there. Mikey's gaze lifted, his eyes wide, a mixture of hope and uncertainty swirling within them. Do you really mean that? Thomas nodded, his grip on the boy's hand tightening ever so slightly. I do. I promise. Whatever it takes, I want to be the person you can count on. For a moment, Mikey looked like he might cry, but he quickly blinked it away, nodding as if trying to accept this new reality, trying to believe that he was no longer alone. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet stretching between them like a fragile, newfound bond. Thomas glanced at the notebook again, feeling as if Catherine herself were there with them, urging him to make good on his promise. She had left him with this final gift, a chance to love her son, to give him the safety and stability she had wanted for him. And as daunting as it felt, Thomas knew he couldn't let her down, couldn't let Mikey down. Finally, he broke the silence, offering a small smile. I was thinking, maybe we could go to some of the places your mom and I used to go. I could show you the city, introduce you to the places that meant something to her. Mikey's eyes lit up, a faint smile breaking through his lingering sadness. I'd like that. Thomas felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Then that's what we'll do, he said softly. We'll start tomorrow. As Mikey headed back to bed, Thomas watched him go, feeling a quiet resolve settle in his heart. He knew there would be difficult days ahead, that learning to be a father would be full of challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to build a life with this boy who had become his son. Ready to honor Catherine's memory by giving Mikey the family he deserved. And as he closed the notebook and turned off the light, Thomas knew that, finally, he was no longer running from the past. He was running toward something, toward a future that felt real and solid, something worth fighting for. The next morning, Thomas was up early, preparing breakfast in a kitchen that still felt oddly empty despite the presence of his son. He could hear Mikey stirring in the next room, and a part of him felt nervous. Nervous to show the boy pieces of his life with Catherine, nervous that he might not live up to whatever expectations Mikey had of him. But he pushed the doubts aside, focusing on flipping pancakes, the one breakfast item he knew he could make without burning. When Mikey emerged, rubbing his eyes and glancing around as though he was still getting used to this new reality, Thomas greeted him with a tentative smile. Morning. I thought we'd start today with a tour of some places your mom loved. And breakfast, of course. Mikey's eyes lit up as he noticed the pancakes stacked on the table. You made all these? He asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. Thomas laughed, a bit self-conscious. Well, I figured we could both use a good start. I don't always cook, so don't get too used to it. Mikey gave a small smile and settled into his chair, grabbing a fork and knife. They ate in relative silence, though it was a comfortable one, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware on plates. Thomas found himself watching Mikey, studying the way the boy's expressions would change as he thought through something, as if weighing each small detail before letting it out. Catherine had been the same way, thoughtful to the point of silence, especially when something was troubling her. After breakfast, they put on their jackets, ready to brave the crisp morning air. Thomas guided Mikey through the bustling streets of the city, the sound of distant car horns and conversations floating around them. He pointed out little landmarks along the way, small memories that made up the mosaic of his life with Catherine. The bookstore she loved, the cafe where she'd made him try his first espresso, which he'd hated, much to her amusement. And finally, they reached the old art supply shop, a small, unassuming place tucked between two larger stores. "Your mom used to come here all the time," Thomas said, nodding toward the shop's modest display window, filled with charcoal, paintbrushes, and stacks of worn sketchbooks. She'd spend hours picking out just the right pencils, looking for the perfect shade of paint. She was meticulous like that. Mikey looked through the glass with a quiet reverence. "She loved drawing," he murmured, more to himself than to Thomas. "She used to draw with me sometimes, when she wasn't too tired." Thomas swallowed hard, hearing the boy's words. He hadn't known that side of Catherine, the mother, the woman who spent her evenings sketching with her son, sharing pieces of herself that Thomas would never know. He realized, for perhaps the first time, that Catherine had created a whole life after they'd parted, a life he could only glimpse through the eyes of this child. They stepped into the shop, the smell of paper and ink washing over them. Thomas watched as Mikey wandered down the aisles, his fingers grazing over the art supplies with the same look of wonder Catherine had worn years ago. He let Mikey take his time, watching the boy pick up a charcoal pencil, studying it before carefully placing it back. "Do you like to draw?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice light. Mikey shrugged, though there was a spark in his eye. "A little. Mom taught me some things, but I'm not very good." Thomas smiled, leaning down to meet his gaze. "Your mom used to say the same thing about herself, but she always believed that it wasn't about being good. It was about expressing yourself, finding what's inside you and putting it on the page." Mikey nodded, his face thoughtful as he turned back to the display, his fingers reaching for a small, leather-bound sketchbook. Thomas noticed the price tag and made a quick decision. "Would you like to get that one?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. Mikey's eyes widened slightly, as though the thought hadn't even crossed his mind. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Thomas replied. "I think your mom would want you to keep drawing, and I'd like to see what you come up with." The boy's face softened, and he nodded, clutching the sketchbook close as though it were a precious gift. They paid for it at the counter, and as they left the shop, Thomas felt a strange satisfaction settle in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was a small thing, a simple sketchbook, but it felt like a step towards something bigger, a bridge between himself and this boy he was slowly coming to know. They spent the rest of the day wandering through Catherine's favorite spots. Thomas showed Mikey the old library she used to frequent, where she'd once convinced him to read a novel cover to cover, only for him to admit he didn't understand half of it. They laughed at the memory, and for the first time, Thomas noticed how easily the boy's laugh blended with his own, the sound light and familiar. As the day wore on, they found themselves at the park by the pond, the same spot where they'd sat the day before. Thomas sat down on the bench, and Mikey followed, his new sketchbook in hand. The boy flipped it open, carefully tracing his fingers over the blank pages as though feeling the potential within them. After a moment, Mikey looked up, his gaze steady. "Can you tell me more about her?" Thomas took a deep breath, nodding. He had been waiting for this question, but he wanted to give the boy something real, something honest. "Your mom. She was one of a kind," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "She was stubborn, fearless, and sometimes a little reckless. But she had this way of seeing the world, of finding beauty in places most people would just walk by. She taught me things without even realizing it." Mikey listened intently, his gaze fixed on Thomas, absorbing each word. Thomas felt a pang of regret, knowing there was so much he would never be able to tell him, so many pieces of Catherine that were lost forever. But he pushed on, determined to share as much as he could. "She used to make me laugh, too," Thomas continued, smiling at the memory. "She'd tell these stories, get so animated, and even if they were silly, you couldn't help but laugh. And whenever I was feeling lost, she seemed to know just what to say to make everything feel possible." Mikey smiled softly, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and joy. "She sounds amazing." "She was," Thomas said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "And you remind me of her, in ways you might not even realize." Mikey looked away, his face coloring slightly. He opened his sketchbook, glancing up at Thomas almost shyly. Would you sit with me while I draw? Just for a little while? Thomas felt his heart swell, and he nodded, settling in beside the boy as he watched him lift the charcoal pencil to the paper, his small fingers moving carefully over the page. Mikey's expression was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration, but there was a peacefulness about him, a sense of calm that Thomas hadn't seen before. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Mikey drew, and Thomas watched in silence, feeling something fall into place between them. It was as though, in this quiet moment, they had found a piece of Catherine together, something unspoken yet deeply understood. The bond they shared wasn't something he could explain or even put into words, but it was there, steady and real, as certain as the fading sunlight around them. When Mikey finally finished, he looked up, a proud but uncertain smile on his face. He turned the sketchbook toward Thomas, revealing a simple drawing of the pond, the trees, and the gentle ripple of water beneath the setting sun. It was rough, the lines a little shaky, but Thomas could see Catherine's touch in it, the way Mikey had captured the small details, the things most people would overlook. It's beautiful, Mikey, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. You've got your mom's eye, you know that? Mikey's face lit up, a look of pride mingling with something softer, something vulnerable. Thanks, he whispered, closing the sketchbook and clutching it close. As they walked home in the fading light, Thomas felt a strange, profound peace settle over him. He knew there would be hard days ahead, questions he couldn't answer, memories that might hurt. But for the first time, he felt ready to face them, knowing that he wasn't alone. He had Mikey, and in some small way, he had Catherine, too, living on in each line, each sketch, each moment he shared with their son. And as they made their way down the quiet street, side by side, Thomas felt that they were not just moving forward but beginning something new, something precious, with a hope that, finally, felt real. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning that brought a calmness Thomas had forgotten was possible. Sunlight spilled through the windows, casting warm, dappled light across the living room where Mikey sat, focused intently on his new sketchbook. Thomas had watched him every day since they'd bought it, noticing how the boy would disappear into the pages, finding a rhythm and comfort that seemed to pull him away from the world around them. Thomas had grown used to watching Mikey's creative process, seeing him lost in concentration, his pencil moving in careful, measured strokes. Today, however, he noticed something different in the boy's expression, a hint of hesitation, a lingering uncertainty as he stared at the blank page before him. Thomas could tell that Mikey was wrestling with something, and he felt a pang of curiosity mixed with worry. He set down his coffee and approached Mikey quietly, lowering himself onto the couch beside him. "You doing all right?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle, hoping not to startle him out of his thoughts. Mikey looked up, his fingers tightening around the pencil. He hesitated, glancing at Thomas before looking back down at the blank page. I was trying to draw her. Mom, Thomas felt a pang in his chest at Mikey's words. He hadn't expected this. "That's a big thing to take on," he said softly. "Are you finding it hard to start?" Mikey nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the paper as though it held some answer he couldn't quite grasp. "I remember her face, sort of, but not every detail. It's like the memory is fading." His voice was tinged with frustration and a sadness that made Thomas's heart ache. Thomas placed a hand on Mikey's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You know, it's okay if it's not perfect," he said. "What matters is how you feel when you're drawing her. If it feels right to you, then that's enough." Mikey's face softened a little, but he still looked uncertain. He began sketching faint outlines, tentative strokes that barely touched the paper, as if afraid of committing to anything more concrete. Thomas watched him, feeling the weight of his own memories creeping in. He knew the struggle Mikey was facing, the way time could distort even the most precious images, blurring them until only fragments remained. After a while, Thomas stood up, an idea taking shape in his mind. He moved to the small cabinet in the corner of the living room, opening a drawer where he kept a few items he rarely looked at but had never had the heart to throw away. Among them was a small, leather-bound journal, Catherine's old diary, The one she'd given him long ago, back when they had shared everything, back when she had trusted him with parts of herself that no one else had ever seen. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he carried it back to the couch. Mikey looked up, curiosity in his eyes as Thomas sat down beside him, the journal resting in his lap. "Your mom. She used to keep this diary," Thomas explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She stopped writing in it years ago, but there are sketches in here, too. Pieces of her, little glimpses of what she was feeling. Maybe it could help you." Mikey stared at the diary, his gaze intense, almost reverent. You kept it all this time?" Thomas nodded, brushing his fingers over the worn leather cover. "I did. I don't look at it often, but it felt wrong to let it go. It was a part of her." He handed it to Mikey, who took it gingerly, his hands barely grazing the cover, as though afraid he might damage it. Slowly, he opened the first page, and Thomas watched as the boy's eyes widened, taking in the drawings, the notes, the fragments of thoughts that Catherine had left behind. The first few pages were filled with sketches, rough, unfinished portraits of places and people, familiar faces he knew Catherine had seen every day. But as Mikey flipped further, he found something else, something more personal. A series of self-portraits. Each one was different, capturing a range of expressions and moods that Thomas had seen in her but had never fully understood. He could see Catherine's struggles in those sketches, the isolation, the longing, and perhaps most painfully, the resignation in her eyes as she drew herself. She looked sad," Mikey murmured, his fingers tracing over one of the drawings. "Was she always sad?" Thomas took a deep breath, his mind racing through memories he hadn't touched in years. "She had moments of sadness, yes," he admitted. "But she had happy moments, too. She was complicated. She felt things deeply, and sometimes that made things harder for her." Mikey continued flipping through the pages, absorbing every detail, his brow furrowed in concentration. He reached a page filled with Catherine's handwriting, the words scrawled in her familiar, hurried style. "Some days, I feel like I'm only half here, like there's a part of me that's missing. But I keep going, for him, for our future. I hope someday he'll understand." Mikey looked up at Thomas, confusion mingling with sadness in his expression. What did she mean? Who was she writing about? Thomas felt his heart twist. "I think she was writing about both of us," he said quietly. "About me, and maybe about you, too. She wanted you to have a good life, Mikey. She wanted to protect you, even when it meant being apart." The boy's gaze dropped back to the diary, his hands clutching it tightly. He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "She did a lot for me. I know that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I wish she didn't have to do it alone." Thomas reached out, placing a hand on Mikey's shoulder, feeling the weight of his own regrets mingling with the boy's. "You're not alone, Mikey. Not anymore." They sat together in silence, the room filled with an unspoken understanding. Thomas could feel the ghosts of the past settling around them, memories that were painful but somehow comforting in their presence. It was as if Catherine herself were there, guiding them, urging them to find peace in the fragments she had left behind. Finally, Mikey turned to him, a small, determined look on his face. "I want to try drawing her again," he said, his voice steady. "But this time, could you help me? Could you tell me more about what she was like?" Thomas smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Of course," he replied softly. "I'd love to." They spent the afternoon working together, Thomas sharing stories as Mikey's pencil moved across the page. He told him about Catherine's favorite songs, the way she'd hum quietly to herself when she was happy, the way her eyes would light up whenever she talked about something she loved. He described her laugh, bright and unrestrained, and how she would always scrunch her nose when she was deep in thought. Mikey absorbed it all, his face lighting up as he added each detail to his drawing, his strokes growing more confident with every memory. Thomas felt something shift within him, a lightness, a sense that he was finally able to share the best parts of Catherine, to honor her memory in a way he hadn't been able to before. When Mikey finally finished, he held up the sketch, looking at it with a mixture of pride and sadness. The drawing wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably Catherine. Her eyes looked out from the page, warm and kind, with that slight hint of sadness that had always lingered within her. Mikey stared at it, his lips curving into a small, bittersweet smile. "She'd be proud of you," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You captured her beautifully." Mikey looked up, his eyes shining. "Thank you for telling me about her. I feel like I know her better now." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the past beginning to lift. "And if you ever want to know more, I'm here. We can keep her memory alive together." They sat there for a while, side by side, the drawing resting between them, a testament to the love they both shared for a woman who had touched their lives in ways neither of them would ever forget. And as the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the room, Thomas knew that, though they had lost Catherine, her spirit would live on in the bond he and Mikey were building. For the first time, Thomas felt certain that they could face whatever came next, together. And in that quiet moment, he felt at peace, ready to embrace the future with his son by his side. The days drifted into a steady rhythm, and Thomas found himself settling into a life he hadn't known he could want. Mornings were filled with the soft hum of routine. Breakfast shared over the table, walks through the city, moments when he and Mikey would just sit and talk, or sometimes say nothing at all. It amazed him how comfortable the silences had become, how much was understood without a word. One afternoon, as they returned from the park, Thomas's phone rang. He recognized the number immediately, Clara, Catherine's old friend. They hadn't spoken since that first meeting at her bookstore, when everything had started to unravel, but he had a sense she had been waiting, watching, giving him the time and space he needed to process everything. "Thomas," she greeted warmly, though he could hear a hint of something more in her voice, a quiet urgency. "Clara," he replied, glancing at Mikey, who was busy flipping through his sketchbook. "It's good to hear from you." "How's Mikey?" she asked gently. Thomas smiled, though there was a bittersweet edge to it. He's doing well, all things considered. We're learning how to do this together." "I'm glad to hear that," Clara said, her voice softening. "But there's something I think you need to know. Something I didn't tell you before." Thomas felt a chill run through him, the familiar tension creeping back into his shoulders. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "What is it?" "It's about Catherine," Clara continued, her tone cautious, almost hesitant. "There were things she didn't want you to know, things she kept to herself. But I think now, with Mikey in your life, you should know the full story." Thomas glanced at Mikey, who looked up, sensing his father's tension. "Can you give me a minute, buddy?" he asked gently, nodding toward Mikey's room. Mikey looked hesitant but nodded, standing up and slipping into his room, giving Thomas a small, curious smile as he closed the door. Once alone, Thomas turned his attention back to Clara. "Go on," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Catherine was diagnosed earlier than you might have thought," Clara explained, her words careful but direct. "It was years before she passed, back when Mikey was still very young. She didn't tell anyone at first. She was afraid, Thomas. Afraid of what it would mean, and afraid of the impact it would have on you, on Mikey." Thomas closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He had known she was a private person, but he had never realized just how much she had kept hidden, how deeply she had carried her burdens without letting anyone close enough to help. "She went through it alone," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Clara said, a sadness in her voice. "But there was one thing she did, one last thing she wanted, and it's why I'm calling you now. She wrote letters, Thomas. Letters for you and for Mikey. She wanted him to have them when he was ready, but she left it up to me to decide when that time would come." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of everything suddenly feeling overwhelming. "Letters?" he repeated, trying to absorb the meaning behind them. "She wanted him to know her, to understand why she made the choices she did," Clara explained. "And she wanted you to know, too. She asked me to give them to you when I thought you were both ready." Thomas swallowed, nodding as he took a shaky breath. I think we're ready." They agreed to meet the next day, and Thomas hung up, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The idea of letters, Catherine's words reaching them from beyond felt like both a gift and a wound, something that would bring comfort but also open old scars. He sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of it settle. Mikey emerged from his room, sensing the change in his father's demeanor. "Is everything okay?" Thomas forced a smile, motioning for him to come over. "I just talked to Clara. She has something for us. Some letters your mom wrote. She wanted us to have them when the time was right." Mikey's eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, more hopeful. "Letters from Mom?" "Yeah," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "I don't know what they say, but I think it'll help us understand her better." The next morning, they walked together to Clara's bookstore, their steps slower than usual, each lost in their own thoughts. The air felt heavy, as though they were walking into something sacred, something that would change them both. Clara greeted them at the door, her expression warm but somber. She led them to a quiet corner of the store, where a small stack of envelopes sat waiting on the table. Thomas felt his breath catch as he looked at them. Each one was marked in Catherine's handwriting, the letters faded but familiar. There were two piles, one for him and one for Mikey. "Take your time," Clara said softly, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "She wanted you both to have this." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard as he took his pile. He glanced at Mikey, who was staring at the letters in silence, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch them. They sat down together, side by side, and Thomas placed a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. Mikey took a deep breath, carefully opening the first envelope. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, and as he began to read, his face softened, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Thomas could see the boy's eyes shine as he absorbed each word, the connection to his mother feeling almost tangible in that moment. Thomas opened his own letter, his hands shaking as he unfolded the paper. Catherine's handwriting filled the page, her words steady, deliberate, as though she had chosen each one with care. He began to read, his heart pounding as her voice came to life through her words. "Thomas, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to explain things myself. I know I left you with questions, and for that, I'm sorry. I wish I could have told you everything, but I didn't know how. Loving you was one of the best things that ever happened to me, but I knew that to give Mikey the life he deserved, I had to make a choice. I wanted him to grow up safe, to be free from the pain I knew I was carrying." Thomas felt his throat tighten, his vision blurring as he continued reading. "You were my light, my anchor, but sometimes love isn't enough to hold everything together. I hope you can forgive me for leaving, for the secrets I kept, but more than anything, I hope you find peace. And I hope that you and Mikey can give each other the love I never found the strength to accept for myself." He looked over at Mikey, who was still absorbed in his letter, his expression a mixture of joy and sadness. Thomas could see the boy's shoulders relax, a sense of comfort settling over him as he read his mother's words. After a long silence, Mikey looked up, his eyes misty but filled with a quiet strength. "She loved us," he said simply, as though the words held everything he needed to know. Thomas nodded, reaching over to pull him into a hug, holding him close. "She did," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved us both, more than we ever knew." They sat there together, the letters resting in their hands, feeling the weight and the warmth of Catherine's love wrap around them. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the years they had lost, but it was enough. It was more than enough. As they left the bookstore, Thomas felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that, at last, he had come to the end of one journey and the beginning of another. With Mikey by his side, he knew they would carry Catherine's memory forward, not as a shadow but as a light guiding them both. And as they walked home together, the letters tucked safely in their pockets, Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle in his heart, a certainty that, no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, bound by the love they had lost and found once more. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet transformation for both Thomas and Mikey. They returned to their routines, but something had shifted, something unspoken but deeply felt. The letters from Catherine became a constant source of comfort, like a steady undercurrent, carrying them through moments of uncertainty and sadness. Mikey would read his letters often, especially at night, holding the pages with care, as though the words might slip away if he weren't careful. Thomas, too, found himself reaching for Catherine's words in the quiet moments, letting her voice guide him through this unexpected role as a father. Her letters had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: a sense of permission to move forward, to let go of the guilt he'd carried since the day she left. And more than that, her words had given him hope, a belief that he could be enough for Mikey, that he could honor her memory by giving their son the life she dreamed of. One chilly autumn afternoon, Thomas and Mikey found themselves at the park by the pond, the place they had come to think of as theirs. The leaves were a vibrant mix of red and gold, carpeting the ground in a soft, colorful blanket. Mikey had brought his sketchbook, and he sat on the bench beside Thomas, his pencil moving across the page in careful strokes as he captured the scene before them. Thomas watched him for a moment, marveling at the boy's concentration, his quiet dedication. It struck him how much Mikey had grown in just a few short months, how his confidence had blossomed, how his laughter came more easily now. And as he watched, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude, a feeling that, despite everything, they had been given a chance to build something beautiful together. After a while, Mikey looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze with a small, thoughtful smile. "I think she'd like it here," he said quietly, nodding toward the pond. "Mom, it feels like a place she would have come to think." Thomas smiled, a warmth spreading through him. "Yeah, I think she would have," he agreed, his voice soft. "She always loved places like this, quiet spots where she could just be." Mikey nodded, his gaze drifting back to the pond. "Sometimes I feel like she's still here, you know? Like she's watching over us." Thomas felt his chest tighten, a mix of sorrow and comfort flooding through him. "I think she is, Mikey. And I think she's proud of you, of the person you're becoming." Mikey's face softened, a shy smile breaking through. "I hope so." They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the park, and the air had a crispness to it that hinted at the coming winter. Thomas felt a sense of finality in the moment, as though they were closing a chapter, ready to move forward but never forgetting the journey that had brought them here. After a while, Mikey turned to him, his eyes bright with an idea. "Dad, could we do something special to remember her? Like, something just for us?" The word caught Thomas off guard, the casual way Mikey had called him Dad, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His heart swelled, and he nodded, his voice catching as he replied, "Of course, Mikey. What did you have in mind?" Mikey's face lit up, the excitement shining in his eyes. "What if we plant a tree for her? Right here in the park. Something that'll grow tall and strong. Like the way she was." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, a mixture of pride and sadness filling him. "I think that's a beautiful idea," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have loved that." They made plans to talk to the park's management, and a few weeks later, on a cold but clear morning, they returned with a young oak sapling, a small shovel, and a handful of soil. They picked a spot by the pond, close to their bench, a place where the tree would have sunlight and space to grow. The park staff had granted them permission, and even some of the other visitors watched as father and son dug into the earth together, preparing a place for this living tribute to Catherine's memory. Mikey worked with a quiet determination, his hands moving steadily as he dug the small hole. Thomas helped him, the two of them working side by side, sharing in the simple but profound task of planting a future together. When they finally placed the sapling in the ground, Mikey stood back, brushing the dirt from his hands, his eyes shining with pride. "Do you think it'll grow big?" he asked, looking up at Thomas with a hopeful expression. Thomas knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I think it'll grow as strong as we let it," he replied gently. "As long as we take care of it, give it what it needs. Just like how we're taking care of each other." Mikey nodded, his gaze fixed on the tree, a quiet understanding in his eyes. "I'll come back here a lot, to make sure it's okay, and to talk to her maybe." Thomas's heart swelled, and he pulled Mikey into a hug, holding him close. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. And I'll be here with you, every step of the way." They stood there, watching as the young tree swayed gently in the breeze, its leaves rustling softly in the wind. It was a small sapling, but it held the promise of something enduring, something that would grow and change with them. Thomas felt a peace settle over him, a sense that they had finally found a way to honor Catherine, to carry her memory forward in a way that was both hopeful and healing. In the days and weeks that followed, they made it a ritual to visit the park, checking on the tree's progress, sharing stories about Catherine, and building new memories of their own. The tree grew stronger with each passing season, its roots digging deeper into the soil, a living reminder of the love that had shaped them both. And as the years went by, Thomas watched Mikey grow, watched him blossom into a young man with Catherine's kindness, her quiet strength, and a resilience all his own. He felt a pride that words could never fully capture, a gratitude for the journey they had taken together, for the family they had become. The tree by the pond grew tall and steady, its branches stretching toward the sky, a testament to the love they had lost and the love they had found anew. And each time Thomas and Mikey returned to that park, they knew that Catherine was with them. In the rustling leaves, in the gentle sway of the branches, and in the quiet bond they shared. Together, they had built something that would last, a life filled with love, laughter, and a memory that would live on, as timeless and enduring as the roots of the oak tree they had planted in her name.